One of the most amazing things about the way that God begins to introduce his redemptive plan into the world, it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. We can learn a lot about God's intention, his redemptive plan, by looking back to the creation account, what humanity was originally intended to exist like. Genesis 1:26 and 28 kind of reveals a bit of that, and I've included that there in the notes. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image, the image of God. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over essentially all creation. What's beautiful about what's revealed here is not just that God created human beings in his likeness, but that he created us with a purpose of shared dominion over creation. The shared purpose did come with a qualifier, though, that we're not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is also there in the Garden of Eden. But we find the first mentions of God's redemptive plan at the very onset of sin in Genesis chapter 3. I've included this in the notes as well. God communicated his intention to restore every consequence of sin as soon as sin entered the story. The Bible intentionally describes the very end of the story from the beginning. And interestingly, the first mention of God's redemptive plan actually was directed to Satan himself. You can see I'm going to scroll up just to bring that up a little bit. Listen to what God said to Satan. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. She will bruise your head and you will bruise his heel. Now, my ESV translation, I put this in the notes, it says that the children of Eve will bruise your head, but the Hebrew is often translated as crush your skull. And more precisely, kind of the picture that the Hebrew is giving is that she will have the ultimate control of your end. Remarkably, one of the first descriptions of the people of God's promise is that we would be skull crushers through Eve's descendants. Many of the messianic promises that we'll look at actually relate to this skull crushing promise. It's very, very interesting. All right, quickly want to look at then the covenant foundations. God's promises of redemption continue through the divine appointment of a specific family lineage. The earliest mentions of the salvation of the nations and the reconciliation of humanity to God find their roots in God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These promises were where God began to define the terms of his redemptive plan of the earth's restoration, to initiate his redemptive plan for the nations through the family of Abraham. And I want to take a look at some of these. Again, I'm going to try to move kind of quickly. I might skip over some, but I've included many of these accounts through. I mean, if you want to have some fun, you just need to open your Bible, read Genesis 12 through 17 and 18, get into the book of Genesis and look at some of these covenant passages because the story is really fascinating. I don't have time to go into all of it today. One day I'm sure we will, but we would be here all day. But just quickly, God makes a promise to Abraham in Genesis 12. He says that in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Through this lineage, all the families of the earth will be blessed. I want to jump to Genesis 17. Look at the way that when God renames Abraham, the way that he defines this covenant that he's making. He says, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. Everlasting covenant. I've highlighted that because that's very important. To be God to you and to your offspring after you, and I will give you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. Again, Genesis 17 is pretty emphatic. Everlasting possession. And I will be their God, speaking generationally into Abraham's descendants. Again, the covenant proceeds through Isaac. You have the Isaac and Ishmael siblinghood, but look at what he says about Isaac. He says, you will call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant through him, Isaac, as an everlasting covenant. Again, everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. Again, in Genesis 18, God reiterates to Abraham, I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. Or I just read that. All the nations of the earth will be blessed in him. That's what I'm trying to say. When Abraham's about to sacrifice Isaac, Genesis 22, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. To Isaac, he says, in your offspring, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. To Jacob, he says, in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. We're just tracing this covenant generationally through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We'll come back later to the reconciliation of Jacob and Esau. We can look at that more in a future week because that is relevant for God's redemptive plan. Actually, the story of Jacob and Esau, super fascinating. The way that it turns out, they really do reconcile in the end, which is awesome. Jacob is blessed and renamed Israel, and God says, I will give you the land. I will give the land to your offspring after you. And then we're going to jump ahead to Moses. A beautiful thing happens at Mount Sinai with Moses as Israel has come out of Egypt. Again, just to track kind of the generations, kind of getting ahead of myself. But you've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You've got Jacob's sons. Jacob is renamed Israel, but you've got Jacob's sons, which become the 12 tribes of Israel. But first, they are taken into Egypt. Remember, Joseph gets sold into slavery in Egypt, and there's a big famine, and eventually all of Joseph's family migrate. They move to Egypt, where they're fed and housed. Eventually, they're taken into slavery in Egypt. But then you have Moses, who delivers them from Egypt. Now they're out in the wilderness. They're at Mount Sinai, and God is again reiterating his covenant, really he's inviting Israel as a nation into betrothal for this covenant that he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And again, he's going to say similar things, but I'll just pull it up real quick in the notes. And he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of all the people. This is Moses reading the covenant to all the people, and look at how the people respond. They say, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the book of the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant of the Lord has made with you in accordance with these words. And there's this kind of ceremony that they go through that is a betrothal of Israel as a people to God. And even later, God and Moses reiterate the covenant again when there's the whole golden calf incident. The covenant gets renewed again there. So again, continuing further into the law of Moses, God repeatedly defines the cup of his blessing when the covenant is fulfilled and the cup of his wrath when there's rebellion against the covenant. We're going to look at some of those passages here today in Leviticus and Numbers and in Deuteronomy. But in the cup of his blessing, God's promises to Israel are fulfilled, and Israel is prosperous and exalted. And so God's blessing to the earth and to Israel are becoming an inseparable reality, that Israel is really deeply involved in God's redemptive plan, not just for one people and one nation, but for all the nations. That's a little bit of the covenant foundations I wanted to touch on. And there's very specific, we'll come back to this later because there's many prophecies to the rest of biblical prophecy that come back and reference the original promises of the land borders for Israel. And I've included those references there. I'm not going to get into them today, but we will come back to them later because, again, many biblical promises reference God's going to restore the original borders of not just Israel, but of many nations. You can see some of them there. Very interesting. All right. I do want to just point out there's some Bible teachers that suggest that Israel has historically experienced the final fulfillment of God's covenant and that there should be no further expectation for the fulfillment of God's covenant with Israel. And they reference often Joshua 21 and Joshua 23. And again, those are pretty remarkable descriptions of the fulfillment of God's covenant in their day. that doesn't mean that there's no future fulfillment. It's a little bit of a assumption to say that was the final fulfillment and that seals it for history and there's no more relevance of God's covenant with Israel. It kind of that begins to face contradiction when you progress just down your page in the Bible from chapter 23 to chapter 24, and Joshua leads Israel in renewing the covenant again. It wouldn't make any sense if God's covenant with Israel was finished and then he says again, now let's renew again. That would be contradictory. Also, I love to reference Psalm 105. Look at what's described here in Psalm 105 about God's covenant with Israel. It very closely resembles the way that God talked about the covenant in Genesis 17, which we looked at earlier. He says, He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in the earth. He remembers his covenant forever. Which covenant? The word that he commanded for 1,000 generations. Which word? The covenant that he made with Abraham. His sworn promise to Isaac, which he confirmed to Jacob as a statute, to Israel when Jacob was renamed, as an everlasting covenant. We just looked at those references back in Genesis. We put all this together into this one set of notes so that it's easy to grab a hold to. All right, we're going to skip through understanding biblical prophetic fulfillment. That's there in the notes for you for later.